Hello, this is the Presidency Section B lecture. Our prioritized standard is Government Civics 17. Objectively, we're going to investigate the presidential administration. The president does not manage the federal government alone, as much of the work is done by the presidential administration, including the Executive Office of the President, or EOP, the executive departments, and several independent agencies. The Executive Office of the President, or EOP, is made up of several influential agencies that perform key functions for the President. Now, the EOP is overseen by the White House Chief of Staff and includes important officials like the Press Secretary, which is usually the person you see on press conferences for the White House, and the President's Counsel or legal advisor. Now, the EOP is home to many of the President's closest policy and political advisors, including the Council of Economic Advisors, the National Security Council, the Office of Management and Budget, the Council of Environmental Quality, the Office of Administration, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, the White House Office, and the Office of the Vice President, among other entities that are a part of this. Much of the work of the federal government is actually done by the 15 executive departments or cabinet departments, which include the Departments of State, Treasury, Defense, Justice, Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Energy, Education, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security. Now, each department is actually headed by a secretary, or in the case of the Department of Justice, an attorney general, which is appointed by the president. The Senate often respects the president's choices. There's only been 9 nominees in the history of the presidency for cabinet positions that have been flat rejected by the Senate. There's only been about 15 officials that have withdrawn their names before actually coming up to a Senate vote. So most of the time, the president gets who they want in these departments. Now, these secretaries make up the cabinet, which is an informal advisory body to the president that regularly meets. The several independent agencies that are part of the executive branch operate independent of presidential control, completing important duties for the federal government or serving in some type of regulatory capacity, which are divided into 3 main groups. One of those groups are independent executive groups, which are agencies headed by a single administrator with regional subunits, but lacking cabinet status. Still, these are largely under presidential control. There's some of these you probably have heard of, like NASA would be an example of one of these, the Environmental Protection Agency, the General Services Administration. These are all types of independent executive groups. There's also independent regulatory commissions. This includes agencies designed to regulate important aspects of the nation's economy, but largely beyond the reach of presidential control. So that would be like the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the FCC, the National Labor Relations Board. So a lot of these that are regulating possibly the economy, the president usually doesn't have much say in what happens here. And there's also government corporations, which are corporations within the executive branch subject to the president's direction and control that are set up by Congress to carry out certain business-like activities. So this would be something like the FDIC, which insures your money in a bank, the U.S. Postal Service, Amtrak, which is a federal-owned train service. TVA used to be one of these examples also. The different executive departments play important roles in conducting both U.S. domestic policy, which is a government strategy for dealing with issues and activities within the nation, so things that happen in America, that is domestic policy, and also foreign policy, which is a government strategy for dealing with issues and activities with other nations. So if it's dealing with the rest of the world, that's considered foreign policy. In a lot of ways, foreign policy can be a political minefield where there are many moving parts that are going to be at play all the time. Now, to help with these policies, we have the Department of State, which is responsible for carrying out the U.S. foreign policy abroad. They negotiate treaties on behalf of the U.S., with foreign governments and also other types of international organizations. Often they work to defend U.S. positions around the world in this capacity. Also, the Department of State represents U.S. citizens, protecting U.S. citizens overseas from discriminatory and/or inhuman treatments, and also policies to the world. The Department of State also reports on and analyzes conditions in foreign nations and institutions, like the United Nations, as for instance, and generally advances U.S. trade and investments. The Department of the Treasury is responsible for collecting government revenues and paying out all government expenses. So when you have to pay money to the government, you're actually paying it to the Department of Treasury. When you get a check from the government, it's actually a check written from the Department of the Treasury. Now, the Treasury prints all paper currency and mints all the coins. They do this through the Bureau of Engraving and Imprinting and also the U.S. Mint, respectively, but again, at the direction of the Treasury Department. Now, the Treasury collects all federal taxes through the Internal Revenue Service, or the IRS, and the Department of Treasury also manages our national debt. So they're the one that does all that borrowing of the money that we do. The Department of Defense coordinates and supervises all the government agencies dealing with national security and the U.S. Armed Forces. Now, the Department of Defense, or DoD for short, is divided into three major departments, which include the Department of the Army, the Department of the Navy, and the Department of the Air Force. Now, there are several intelligence agencies, spying, which are subordinate to the Department of Defense, which include the Defense Intelligence Agency, or DIA, and also the National Security Agency, or the NSA. So we do have our own spying agencies that are part of the Department of Defense. Now, the Department of Justice is responsible for the enforcement of federal law and the administration of justice in the United States. The Department of Justice, or DOJ for short, supervises several federal law enforcement agencies like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or the ATF, and also the Drug Enforcement Administration, or the DEA. Now, the Department of Justice is also responsible for investigating federal crimes, trying or prosecuting criminal and civil cases in federal courts, and operating the federal prisons. Now, the Department of Education, this establishes federal education policy, administers and coordinates most federal education assistance programs, collects data on U.S. schools, and they also enforce federal education laws regarding privacy and civil rights. The other executive departments are responsible for a wide range of federal government programs and policies that are responsible for executing both domestic and foreign policy. All right, that concludes Presidency Section B lecture. Our prioritized standard again was Government Civics 17. Objectively, now you can investigate the presidential administration.